Louisiana, 1857. On a night when the river flooded its own banks, a plantation owner made a decision no one dared record. He signed a paper that gave away his only daughter, not in marriage, not in mercy, but as payment for a debt he couldn't face. They called it madness, but the ledgers called it business. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure you've subscribed to the Macabre History. On our channel, we uncover the dark truths of America that have been buried for generations. Drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Her name was Eleanor Boudreaux, the daughter of one of Louisiana's wealthiest plantation owners. History would remember her only in fragments, census records, family ledgers, and one unsigned letter found decades later in the ruins of the house. But those who lived near St. Landry Parish in the summer of '57 still whispered about that night. The night her father, Silas Boudreaux, broke every code of man, God, and property. Silas was a man drowning in debt, consumed by appearances. His wealth had been built not on mastery, but manipulation, generations of lies folded into ledgers and bloodlines. By the time the storms came that year, the banks were closing in. The cotton rotted in the fields. His reputation, his title, his name, everything was slipping away. And then there was Eleanor, 21 years old, heavyset, reclusive, rarely seen outside the house. Rumor said her father kept her hidden from guests, ashamed of her size, her silence, her defiance. She had grown up watching the men who bowed to her father by day and cursed his name by night. She saw the bruises on the backs of those who worked the fields, and worse, she saw how power twisted love into obedience. That night, as lightning split the horizon, Silas made a decision that would damn his legacy forever. In the attic office, surrounded by unpaid notes and whiskey, he signed a paper, a transfer of ownership, a human ledger entry that was never supposed to exist. The document named one man, Isaiah, a field slave born on the property, 31 years old, literate, and known for his silence. It was said that Silas did not sell his daughter that night. He gave her to Isaiah. And from that moment on, nothing that happened at the Boudreaux plantation was ever spoken of again. 3 days later, August 17th, 1857. The rain had stopped, but the house had not dried. The air inside the Boudreaux estate was thick, not with humidity, but with something else, a presence, unspoken and watching. Isaiah had not been seen in the fields since that night. The overseer, a thin man named Carver, swore he had been ordered to release Isaiah from labor. By the master himself, Carver muttered, eyes down, voice hollow. Yet no one could explain why Isaiah now slept in the old carriage house behind the main quarters, a place once reserved for guests, now quiet as a tomb. Eleanor, too, had changed. The servant said she had begun to wander the halls before dawn, barefoot, her white gown dragging across the floorboards, her hands clasped like she was praying. They said she didn't speak, only stared at the portrait of her mother, a painting that hung crooked now after lightning struck the wall behind it. But in the servants' quarters, stories were already taking shape. They said the master had angered the ancestors, that he had treated blood for shame, and that no house built on that act could stand. On the fourth night, Isaiah was seen in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the field, staring at the house, not moving, not speaking, only standing. And when dawn came, The sugar cane around him had turned black, like it had burned from the inside out. The plantation had begun to rot. But it wasn't the rain that caused it. It was the curse of a man who tried to sell his blood and found it bound instead. August 21st, 1857. The cicadas were silent. Even the river that usually whispered through the marsh seemed to hold its breath. Something unseen had shifted in the air, a stillness that made even the bravest field hands refuse to work past sundown. Inside the house, the rot had spread. Wallpaper blistered, candles burned too fast, and the clocks, all three of them, had stopped at the same hour, 2:14 a.m. That was when Eleanor began speaking again. She was found in the library by a maid named Clara, sitting at the desk with her mother's diary open before her. She was humming a song that no one recognized, a low, trembling melody that sounded older than the house itself. When Clara approached, Eleanor looked up, her eyes glassy but focused. "Did he tell you?" she whispered. Clara didn't answer. "He thinks he owns everything, even what can't be owned. But blood remembers what the mind forgets." She closed the diary and pressed it against her chest. "It's all written here, every sin my father buried." That night, Isaiah appeared at the back door. He wasn't carrying tools or baskets, only a small leather-bound book, the same one Eleanor had been reading. No one saw how it changed hands or what words passed between them, but by morning, Eleanor was gone from her room. Silas found the diary on her bed, open to a page written in a trembling hand. The ink had bled from tears or water, no one could tell which. It read, "He thought he was saving her, but he was binding her soul to his debt. And now the one he gave her to will not free her nor forgive her, for the price was never flesh, it was legacy." That was the last entry in Eleanor's handwriting. 2 days later, the plantation cook vanished, then the overseer, then one of Silas's clerks. Their horses were found still tethered, their rooms undisturbed. And each time someone disappeared, the same sound was heard before dawn, the hum of that same old song, drifting through the cane fields like a mourning hymn. The Boudreaux estate was no longer feared for its master. It was feared for what walked freely there now. August 26th, 1857. The sun rose blood red over the cane fields, but Silas Boudreaux didn't see it. He hadn't left his study in nearly a week. The shutters were nailed shut, the lamps burned through the night, and the smell of tobacco, whiskey, and mildew hung like a curse in the air. He'd begun to speak to the walls, at first in whispers, a plea, a prayer, a name. But now the whispers had turned to arguments. "Lies!" he hissed one morning, slamming his hand on the desk. The servants said they could hear him pacing, muttering about forged ledgers and false accounts. They didn't know he'd found the papers, the ones buried beneath a floorboard in the old office, behind the portrait of his wife. Receipts, contracts, transfers of land and people that stretched back 3 generations, names written and crossed out, some in his own family's hand. And there, at the bottom of one crumbling page, a single signature in ink that hadn't faded. Isaiah, not as property, as witness. Silas stared at it until his eyes burned. The man he thought he owned had been here before. The handwriting matched another document, dated 1791, 67 years earlier, a ledger from his grandfather's estate in Virginia. It didn't make sense. It couldn't. But the letters were the same slant, the same ink pattern, the same hand. That night, Silas drank until the candles guttered. He swore he saw someone in the corner of the room, tall, still, watching. The same shape he'd seen in the fields the week before. He called out. No answer, only the echo of his own voice. When he woke, his desk was covered in mud, and written in the center of the ledger, carved through the paper with a blade, were 4 words: "Blood does not die." By morning, every mirror in the house had cracked. The servants begged to leave, but the roads were flooding again, and no one dared cross the river after dark. Silas ordered Isaiah brought to him, but when Carver went to the carriage house, it was empty. Only a faint trail of muddy footprints, leading not out, but up, to the main house.
August 28th, 1857. The housekeeper swore she heard the footsteps first, heavy, deliberate, dragging along the upper hall. When Silas climbed the main staircase with a lantern in hand, the air grew colder with each step. The flame bent sideways, as if the very air were breathing against it. The trail of mud ended at the attic door. He'd sealed that room years earlier, after his wife's death. No one had entered since. The servant said the hinges groaned like a dying man when he forced them open. Dust swirled in the lamplight, thick as fog. The room smelled of iron and rain. His boots sank into the damp boards as if the house itself had been sweating. On the far wall, he saw something that shouldn't have been there. A small table, and on it a book bound in cracked leather. Beside it, a rusted branding iron in the shape of a serpent. Silas approached slowly. The book was open, pages swollen from moisture. The handwriting was his grandfather's. Experiment concluded. Subject unchanged. Eyes the same. Flesh does not age. The entries dated back to 1791, the same year as the first ledger bearing Isaiah's name. His pulse quickened. He turned another page. Isaiah resists instruction, claims to remember the fire at the first estate, claims he will outlive the blood. Silas's mouth went dry. He read on. The boy's mark is not of this soil. His blood carries memory. We trade years for yield. The lamp flickered. A drop of water hit the page. He looked up. The ceiling beams glistened, not with rain, but something darker seeping through the wood. He stepped back, and his heel struck a loose board. Beneath it, something knocked. Once, then twice, from below. He froze. The knock came again. Then the whisper, "Open it." He tore up the plank. A gust of cold air shot out, carrying the scent of river mud and rot. Inside the hollow, wrapped in burlap, was a mask made of leather, human leather, and carved on its forehead the serpent brand. The light flared and died. In the darkness, Silas heard breathing that wasn't his own. And then a voice he had not heard in 20 years. His wife's, soft, broken, and close enough to feel on his neck. You should have never signed the name again. When the servants found him the next morning, Silas Boudreaux was kneeling beside the open floorboard, his eyes wide, his lips moving soundlessly. He was alive, but whatever was inside him was not the man they knew. August 30th, 1857. Silas hadn't slept for 2 days. The The lamps burned out one by one, and still he sat there, hands trembling over the open ledger. He could no longer tell what was real. The shadows seemed to move even when he didn't. By morning, he ordered every servant into the main hall. His voice was hoarse, his eyes wild. He demanded to know who had been in the attic, who had left the papers, who had written Isaiah's name in his books. No one spoke. Then Isaiah entered, calm, silent, barefoot with mud still on his cuffs. He stood in the doorway, meeting Silas's eyes with the stillness of someone who had already endured every punishment a man could invent. "You've been here before. You knew them. My father, my grandfather." Isaiah didn't answer. "Say it," Silas hissed. "Say what you've done to me." Isaiah's voice was steady when he finally spoke. "You did it to yourself." The word struck harder than any curse. Isaiah walked closer, slow, deliberate. He said, "You carry what they built, their names, their debts, their blood. You can bury the bodies, but the paper always remembers." He set a bundle of yellow documents on the desk. These were found under the fields. Contracts, trades, punishments. Your family wrote them all. Every lash, every chain, signed and sealed. Silas stared down at the papers. His family's crest marked the corner of each. The dates stretched back a century, names of men and women bought and sold, and the last entry, the one that froze his breath, bore Eleanor's name. It wasn't a marriage contract. It was a transfer of liability. His own daughter pledged to erase the family's debt to a creditor named Isaiah. He felt his stomach turn. The ink, the handwriting, his own. But the signature was dated months before he'd even met the man. His hands began to shake. Isaiah turned to leave. "The debt is paid, but not by you." That night, Silas burned the documents in the fireplace. Yet the next morning, the ashes were gone and the papers were back on his desk, clean, unscorched, and waiting. And for the first time, the great Silas Boudreaux didn't go to his study to read them. He went there to pray.
October 1923, St. Landry Parish Historical Society, Louisiana. The archivist's hands trembled slightly as he turned the last brittle page. The ink had long since faded, but the story that bled through it had not. It had taken nearly 70 years for anyone to reopen the Boudreaux estate files. The house itself was gone, collapsed in the flood of 1889, washed into the river along with most of its records. What remained was found sealed in a rusted chest beneath the courthouse. Ledgers, letters, and a handful of photographs that no one had seen since the war. The files painted a picture far different from the myths that had haunted St. Landry Parish for generations. There was no ghost, no curse, no haunting music in the cane fields. There was only a system, precise, brutal, and entirely man-made. The documents revealed the truth of Silas Boudreaux's madness. He had been bankrupt long before the storm of 1857. In a desperate attempt to preserve his family's wealth, he forged contracts that used his own daughter's dowry to cover debts owed to his creditors. One of those creditors, a freedman named Isaiah Freeman, had been a former slave of the Boudreaux family, one who had learned to read, write, and record the very transactions that enslaved him. Isaiah's name appeared again and again across the old plantation books, not as property, but as witness. It was his hand that had transcribed the ledgers, his handwriting that preserved the truth Silas wanted buried. When Silas realized what Isaiah had done, something inside him broke.
The final entries in his journal, written the night before his disappearance, were little more than confessions, admissions of forged sales, false baptisms, bribes to judges, and the sale of human lives disguised as debt repayment. The Boudreaux line ended that same year. The last record is of a single grave dug behind the remains of the main house. The marker reads only, Eleanor, born 1836, died 1857. The debt paid. No one ever confirmed how she died. In the closing frame of the Society's report, a historian's voice, low and unhurried, sums it up best. It was never a haunting. It was an inheritance. The ghosts were not spirits, they were records, and the curse was the truth finally refusing to stay buried. The camera fades on the photograph of Isaiah Freeman, standing, unsmiling, in front of a rebuilt chapel in 1871. The caption beneath it reads simply, Clerk, Witness, Survivor. The rest, the historian says, is not myth. It's America. Present day, voiceover narration. What happened at the Boudreaux estate did not end with the flood. It changed its form. The camera pans over a modern skyline, banks, corporate towers, the slow pulse of red lights marking the tops of glass buildings. Every age builds its own plantation. The fields become offices, the chains become contracts, the overseers learn new words, metrics, compliance, productivity, and still the same bargain whispers beneath it all. Trade your time, your body, your silence for someone else's profit. The narrator pauses. The hum of city traffic fills the gap like distant thunder. What Silas believed he could buy innocence, Eleanor believed obedience would earn love. Isaiah understood the truth before any of them did, that the real prison is the lie we agree to live inside. Old photographs fade across the screen, workers in fields, clerks at typewriters, faces staring straight into the lens. The ledger never died, it just changed handwriting. The debts of yesterday became the data of today, and the witnesses, the ones who remember, still walk among us, asking the same question Isaiah wrote in his final line. Who keeps the record when the masters are gone? The sound of paper turning, the narrator's voice softens, almost confessional. Maybe that's why stories like this survive, not to terrify, but to remind, to pull back the curtain and show how power hides in plain sight. We inherit their silence. We also inherit their choice to break it. The screen darkens. Only the voice remains. If you've listened this far, remember the names. Not the myths, not the titles, the names. They are the proof that every system built on control will one day face the truth it tried to bury. A long pause. History is not behind us. It's waiting for us to recognize it in the mirror. The final shot is the same river that once drowned the plantation, still flowing, still carrying silt and secrets. The credits roll over the sound of rushing water. The screen fades to black. A single voice remains, low, measured, carrying the weight of everything you've just heard. You've walked through a story most men would rather forget. Not a ghost story. A record of how power rewrites itself and calls the rewrite progress. If you felt something move inside you while listening, it isn't fear, it's recognition. Because every generation meets the same bargain Silas did. Keep the comfort or face the truth. New York City, 1898. The buildings had changed, the uniforms had changed, but the logic was the same. The railroads ran on coal and iron, and the banks ran on records, ledgers carried north by men like Lucien Duval. The names of fields and workers disappeared, replaced by account numbers and collateral codes. Paper had learned to hide its origin. A junior clerk in one of the new trust companies could trace the genealogy of debt back to the same swampy acres that once bore the Boudreaux name. He never knew it. The numbers no longer looked like people. They looked like progress. Credit became the new harvest. Interest, the new crop. The more a man owed, the more he produced. Corporations sprouted where plantations had rotted, each one promising liberty through ownership, while quietly recreating dependence through loans, wages, and rents. In 1903, the Duval Trust merged into what newspapers hailed as the first truly national bank of the South. The merger documents, still held in a New York archive, carry a curious note on the first page. Assets, accounts receivable, bonds, and intangible goodwill derived from historical holdings. No one asked what historical holdings meant. It meant the past itself, converted into numbers, carried forward like a ghost in the margin. By the 1920s, the idea had gone global. Debts were sold between banks the way crops were once traded between ports. An empire of invisible fields stretched from the Gulf to London. The overseers were now clerks, the whips, fountain pens, the chains, contracts. Economists later called it financial modernization. In truth, it was only the plantation learning to disguise itself. The human names were gone, but the mechanism, the endless conversion of life into yield, remained perfect, silent, and efficient. Every ledger balanced, every column closed, and still, somewhere in the microfilm, one line of handwriting refuses to fade. Balance carried forward. The record remains. Silicon Valley, 2007. Rows of servers hum like beehives in the dark. Engineers walk between the racks, checking temperature gauges, never noticing that each blinking light is a pulse, a living rhythm of the new empire. The ledgers are no longer bound in leather. They breathe in data packets and predictive models. Every search, every purchase, every keystroke feeds the same logic the plantations perfected: measure, categorize, extract. A century earlier, debt was the chain. Now, it is attention. Corporations don't call it control. They call it engagement. The algorithm decides what you see, what you desire, what you fear. It rewards obedience with convenience and punishes disobedience with invisibility. The overseer is now a line of code that learns faster than any human clerk. Inside the glass offices of investment firms, a phrase appears again in quarterly reports: human capital optimization. It is an echo, though no one recognizes its origin. In the archives, the words productivity per body sit beside it, written 100 years earlier in the same precise language. An ethicist at Stanford, reviewing early social network research, writes in her notes, "We have built a plantation of mirrors. Every reflection is sold." No one prints the comment, but the warning spreads quietly among academics. The new question is no longer who owns the fields, but who owns the thoughts. When behavior itself becomes a resource, freedom is defined by how predictably one can act. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizen scrolls through a feed that remembers everything: every anger, every confession, every purchase, each one a tiny entry in a personal balance sheet no one else can see. Credit scores merge with ad profiles, emotions become metrics, privacy becomes myth. The language has changed again: optimization, efficiency, personalization. Different words for the same harvest. And yet, hidden in a forgotten archive at the Library of Congress, the scanned image of the first Boudreaux ledger remains accessible to anyone who knows the catalog number. On its final line, just beneath the faded ink of "balance carried forward," a restorer once penciled a note for context. This handwriting continues unbroken into the digital age. The record still remains. Only the handwriting has changed. Present day. Look at your screen, the narrator says. It's the newest field. The camera glides over faces lit by phones in subways, offices, bedrooms. Every gesture, scroll, tap, pause, feeds the invisible plantation, not through chains or debt, but through need, the need to be seen, to belong, to matter. In the old ledgers, worth was measured in labor. In the new one, it's measured in attention. The plantation has learned empathy. It speaks your language, finishes your sentences, studies your heartbeat through the watch on your wrist. It never shouts. It whispers what you want to hear until you forget it's a command. A social scientist at MIT, reviewing data sets from advertising firms, calls it behavioral indenture. Her paper concludes, "The most efficient system of control is one that rewards compliance with a feeling of freedom." She was ignored. The paper was filed under marketing psychology. The narration continues. Every time a notification lights your screen, it's an invitation to perform. Every metric, likes, followers, ratings, is a modern overseer counting yield. You are free, but you are counted. The scene cuts to a warehouse full of servers humming like the mills of the past. Each server hosts millions of digital selves, replicas built from data, traded in silence. A technician remarks, half joking,
These machines know us better than we know ourselves. The narrator pauses. And that perhaps is the final evolution of the plantation, when the field learns to think for itself, and the harvest becomes human thought. A faint echo of the old line appears on screen, superimposed over scrolling code. Balance carried forward. The record remains. The music fades to a low, steady pulse, half heartbeat, half machine. Then the voice lowers, no longer reporting, but confiding. Awareness is the rebellion. Seeing the pattern breaks its rhythm. You cannot escape a system you refuse to notice, but once you notice, you change the arithmetic. The screen turns black. History doesn't repeat, it updates.
It begins small, like every correction in history. A handful of programmers meet in a rented library basement. No banners, no manifestos. They talk about digital sovereignty, the right to own one's own data the way a farmer once owned his soil. To them, autonomy isn't a slogan, it's arithmetic. Who controls the equation of your life? One of them, a systems engineer named Nina Torres, keeps an image of an old plantation ledger taped to her laptop. The caption reads, "The record remains." When colleagues ask why, she answers, "Because we can still write in it." They build small tools first, open source servers, encrypted journals, local networks that run without ads or algorithms. Nothing revolutionary, just personal gardens cut from the endless field. But when a few thousand people start using them, the pattern shifts. Metrics fall. The feed slows. Somewhere in a marketing office, a graph dips, a barely visible wound in the plantation's perfection. At the same time, psychologists, artists, and teachers begin a different rebellion, teaching attention as discipline. They ask students to track their impulses, to notice when a screen calls their name. Awareness, once philosophy, becomes survival training. The narrator's voice softens. This is how every empire ends. Not with collapse, but with refusal. 1,000 quiet decisions to stop feeding the machine. Old photographs flash, the fields, the factories, the servers, each fading into the next until they merge into a single texture. Rows, grids, patterns. The narrator continues. The plantation was always a geometry of dependence. Break the pattern and the geometry fails. A short montage, communities running mesh networks after storms, farmers trading without intermediaries, small cooperatives printing ledgers by hand again, ink, not data. It isn't nostalgia, it's reclamation. The first step isn't revolution, it's ownership of your breath, your time, your signal. Freedom begins where measurement ends. The music swells, a low, steady rhythm that sounds less like machinery and more like a heartbeat returning to its natural pace. On the screen, the phrase appears one last time. Balance restored. The record rewritten. Fade to black. The conference is small. One room, 40 chairs, no sponsors. A banner reads, "Memory and Autonomy in the Digital Age." Historians, programmers, farmers, and artists have come from every continent. None of them look like revolutionaries. They look like citizens who finally understand what the arithmetic of control has cost.
A historian projects the image of the Boudreaux ledger onto a wall-sized screen. This, she says, is not an artifact, it's a mirror. The paper glows amber under the projector light, its handwriting fragile but legible. The words, balance carried forward, shimmer as if alive. For centuries, she continued, we mistook record-keeping for truth. It was always a tool of power. The moment we can choose what to record, we begin to change who holds the pen. Around the room, others present their work. A collective from Lagos using solar microservers so villages can store data locally beyond corporate reach. A group in Buenos Aires teaching children how to rebuild mechanical radios just to prove that communication doesn't need permission. An artist from Detroit whose exhibition turns personal search histories into poems, transforming surveillance into self-knowledge. The narrator's voice returns, calm but certain. Every act of ownership begins with remembrance. When a people remember together, they stop being data. They become authors. Outside the conference, protests fill the streets. Governments have begun to push back, proposing transparency laws that sound benevolent but tighten the net. Yet something has already changed. The algorithms still measure, but the measurements no longer dictate. People pause before they click. They ask who benefits from their attention. The geometry of dependence is cracking. In the closing scene, the camera follows Nina Torres walking along the River Spy at dusk. She carries a small notebook, its pages filled by hand. On the last line, she writes, slowly, deliberately, "The record remains, but now it's ours." The screen fades to black. Over the sound of water and city wind, the narrator ends. History is not a chain. It is a choice repeated until we choose differently. And when we choose to remember with open eyes, the plantation of land, of paper, of code finally ends. Fade out.
Voiceover, no date, no place. Every archive ends the same way. Someone looking at the last page, deciding what to write next. The camera pans across a row of anonymous faces. Students, welders, nurses, programmers. Screens glow, pages turn, someone writes a note by hand. The narration continues. For 300 years, the record belonged to the powerful. They measured the world and called the measurement truth. But each of us keeps a private ledger now. The moments we give away, the time we trade, the silences we agree to. A slow breath. The story you've just heard isn't only about a family or a nation. It's about the structure of forgetting, how comfort becomes obedience, how convenience becomes control. The plantation still exists wherever a person stops asking who benefits. Old paper dissolves into scrolling code, then into the faint outline of a human fingerprint. If you want to know where history lives, touch the surface of your screen. Every contact leaves a trace. Every trace can become testimony. The tone shifts, quieter, direct. That's why this story ends with you. Because the next entry in the record isn't written by systems or governments or corporations. It's written by awareness, one decision at a time, one refusal at a time. The image is slow. A child deleting an unused app. A worker turning off his phone before sleep. A woman printing a letter instead of sending a message. Small gestures,
microscopic revolutions. Freedom will never be the absence of systems. It will be the presence of choice. The heartbeat that has pulsed beneath every section returns, steady, human, unmechanized. When you look away from the feed, when you remember a name, when you speak a truth no algorithm can predict, you rewrite the record. That is the quietest and the most dangerous rebellion. A long silence. Then, softly, balance restored. The record remains. The record is you. Black screen. End credits roll over the sound of wind and the slow closing of a book. The screen returns to life for a final minute. A single voice, calm, conversational. We didn't invent this story. We assembled it. Archival images fade in, crumbling courthouse papers, freight manifests, ledgers, the first credit cards, computer punch cards, server racks. We didn't invent this story. Every detail you heard comes from real records, plantation accounts from St. Langre Parish, 19th century debt contracts, banking mergers, the first federal credit reports, the early patents for behavioral tracking. None of it required imagination, only connection. The voice pauses. When we began, we thought we were documenting history, but history kept moving. It followed us into databases, into algorithms, into the smallest habits of daily life. The story of power isn't linear, it's recursive. Each generation reinvents the same equation, control disguised as progress, and each generation has to notice it again. A still photograph appears, an archivist's hand holding the edge of a brittle page. In the margin, someone has written in pencil, "Do not discard, contains names." That note became the purpose of this film, to keep the names, to remind us that behind every statistic is a human record, the proof that systems are choices, not destinies. A list of sources scrolls quietly. Public domain archives, university studies, oral history projects, data ethics journals. If you want to read more, start there. The past is open source. You don't need permission to learn from it. The voice lowers one last time. We end where every historian begins, with gratitude to the people who kept the paper, who refused to let silence be efficient. They are the real authors of what you've just heard. Fade to black. A single line appears. This film is dedicated to every witness who chose to remember. Soft, ambient sound. Pages turning, footsteps in a library aisle, and then silence. The screen is black at first, then a line of text fades in. Every system that measures must also erase. A low drumbeat begins, steady, heartbeat slow. Narrator: we followed the ledger from plantation fields to data centers, but there's another chapter, one that hides not in the numbers we keep, but in the voices we delete. Archival footage flickers, telegraph wires, newsroom linotypes, radio control boards, early satellites, fiber optic cables coiled like veins. Before algorithms learned to predict thought, empires learned to manage silence. Censors called it stability. Propagandists called it patriotism. Economists called it confidence. Each name served the same function, to keep the public quiet while the record was rewritten. The tone sharpens, the beat thickens. In the next investigation, we'll open the archives of 20th century information control, from the Creel Commission to the modern disinformation industry, to ask one question: who benefits when truth becomes noise? Newspapers flash across the screen, headlines blurred, margins redacted. The narrator continues. We'll meet the editors who defied blacklists, the scientists who warned of psychological warfare, and the engineers who built the machines that turned stories into weapons. A breath. The music fades to a low hum. Because power doesn't just own the data, it owns the silence between it. And every time a society forgets that, the cycle begins again. A single frame appears, a typewriter page with 5 words typed clean and centered. Balance carried forward. The record remains. The image returns one last time, a slow pan over the river that has flowed through every century of the story. Water against stone, the sound of history washing its own face. Narrator. Every generation inherits a ledger. We don't choose the ink or the columns, only what we add. Some balance it with fear, some balance it with courage. The river fades into the skyline of a modern city, lights flickering like fireflies. People cross bridges, carry groceries, laugh into their phones. Ordinary, unrecorded moments. Power always finds new paper, new screens, new code, but it still depends on one old habit, the hope that no one is paying attention. What defeats it is not outrage, not war, not wealth. It's attention, it's memory. The voice softens to a near whisper. The plantation is gone. The empire will change again, but the record, our shared memory, remains, waiting for honest hands. A final image, the worn ledger page, the words, balance restored, the record rewritten. Then only the sound of pages closing. If you remember, the story stays human. That's all the ending any of us can write. Fade to black. Silence. End.